In this video, we will discuss the structure and summary of the Book of Daniel. When we look at the Book of Daniel, we probably take for granted that it's one complete work written by one author. But what we see here is actually, much like the Hebrew Bible itself, a collection of texts, possibly written by the same author, possibly not. It's set up in two parts. Part 1 is a collection of court tales, which show Daniel at the court of Babylon during the exile. And Part 2 is composed of apocalyptic visions. We can split these up between chapters 1 through part of chapter 7, and then 7 through the end of Daniel in chapter 12. The author of Daniel is anonymous. The name is given to it not because of the author, but who the focus is on. More than likely, the author that we see here was opposed to Maccabean revolt, which we'll talk about here in a moment. When we date this text, we're looking at a wide up to 300-year span of the 5th through the 2nd century BCE. While this text was set in the Babylonian exile, it was written during the Persian period into the Hellenistic period. This makes it the latest text that we actually have in the Hebrew Bible, and probably the reason for its canonization is because it's often attributed to Daniel, simply because his name is put on it, who would have lived before the 4th century BCE. We have a focus in here on Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, Antiochus IV was ruler during the Seleucid Empire, which split off from the Hellenistic Empire, and was the ruler during part of the Maccabean revolt, which happened in the 2nd century BCE. He's viewed as a particularly negative figure along the lines of Nebuchadnezzar II in some of the texts we've seen. This helps indicate that particularly some of the apocalyptic visions were written in the 2nd century BCE rather than before, because of how detailed the text is surrounding the idea of Antiochus IV. Part 1 is composed of court tales, and much of this was actually written in Aramaic, which was common during the Persian period, but not really before. This is part of what helps us date the text that we see here. In addition, some of Part 1 was written in Classical Hebrew, which was used as a literary language during the Persian period, much like Latin was used during the Renaissance of the 16th century England. While this text was written between the 5th and 2nd centuries BCE, it was set in the 6th century during the Babylonian exile. The major concern that we see here is the Jews asking, how do we be Jewish under Gentile rule? Or put another way, how do we preserve our Jewish identity? Now we see this preservation of Jewish identity in various ways throughout the text. Daniel and his friends, who are also Jews, try to maintain their food laws, such as only eating kosher foods, including avoiding pork. They also focus on exclusive worship of Yahweh, which is pushed back against with the episode where they're supposed to worship the emperor. We see an emphasis on prayer, which is what happens with Daniel in the lion's den. One of the interesting things we see throughout the court tales is obviously different tales, possibly by different authors, as Nebuchadnezzar II is portrayed differently throughout the book. Sometimes Nebuchadnezzar is kind. After Daniel proving that the Jews can survive without eating pork and still do sufficient work, Nebuchadnezzar does not force the Jews to eat pork from this point forward. Sometimes he's insane, as we see later towards the end of the court tales. Sometimes he's terrible with a hard heart, as we see. What's significant about the court tales, before we move into the apocalyptic visions, is not what they tell us about Nebuchadnezzar, or even whether the stories are historically accurate or not, but what they tell us about the Jews' experiences, or perceived experiences during the exile. Daniel is very much a character modeled after Joseph in Genesis, interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams, whereas Daniel is interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. We see these various ways of preserving Jewish identity, which is incredibly important to the Jews in the exile as they no longer have a temple to give them identity. As we move into part 2, which is the apocalyptic visions, we need to first talk about apocalyptic literature as a whole. We'll talk about this in much more detail in a later video, but for now, apocalyptic literature is often focused on eschatology, or the last things, study of the last things, the last times, etc. This does not necessarily mean the end of the world, but it could mean the end of an era, or the end of the world as we know it. Apocalyptic literature often focuses on this, and we see this in part 2 of Daniel. We often see an emphasis on cosmic destruction. This is not simply minor scale destruction, but something that happens to a massive amount of people, or even the world. The temple, for example, in its destruction could be seen this way in some apocalyptic literature. We often see a resurrection of the dead, which we do see later on in Daniel as well, and a focus on future judgment, particularly of those who are not righteous. Part 2 of Daniel has extensive apocalyptic imagery, and if you've ever read the book of Revelation in the New Testament, you might recognize some of these images. What we see in Daniel is essentially a coded message, and this is true of many apocalyptic works. Apocalyptic literature often functions as a way of giving some kind of coded message of events that only a particular audience would know, but not the people they're actually talking about. One example from Daniel is the 4 beasts, and we see this theme picked up in other texts like Ezekiel and Revelation as well. In Daniel, we see 4 beasts who come out of the sea, and the sea is significant in the same way that we saw the sea significance in the Enuma Elish. It functions as chaos. There are 4 beasts rising from chaos, and each of these seems to represent a particular empire. In this case, the lion seems to represent the Babylonians, the bear seems to represent the Medes, the leopard seems to represent the Persians, and this final and 4th beast seems to represent the Greeks. It has 10 horns, which represent the Seleucid Empire with 10 rulers, and the final horn is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, this horn, as we've talked about, is the one who is the worst. Antiochus IV was viewed as a terrible ruler and quite cruel to the Jews. So it's not surprising that we see him depicted this way here. The author of Daniel, at least this part of Daniel, clearly had experienced or heard about horrible events that had happened during this time. Now, the Maccabean revolt was occurring during this time, and the Maccabees were a branch of Jews who decided to rebel against the Hellenistic Empire. Some of their methods, particularly the fact that they decided to take on the priesthood, though they were not Zadokites, were not viewed particularly favorably by many Jews. And this is part of the reason that we see the author of Daniel probably pushing back against the Maccabean revolt, but still not favoring Antiochus IV by any means. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, authorial intent, and context of the Book of Daniel, describe the 2 sections of Daniel and the themes found within them, and explain the historical context and importance of apocalyptic texts in Daniel.